My name is Nora Cross. I'm 24 years old. For 24 years, I woke up at 5:15 in the morning to make breakfast for a family that wasn't mine. I didn't know that last part yet. I only knew the alarm, the cold basement floor under my feet, and the sound of Carol Hensley's slippers on the stairs above me if I was even 3 minutes late. I thought the worst part of my life would always be the basement. I was wrong. At my brother's wedding, the wedding I wasn't allowed to sit at a table for, the one I served drinks at in a black polyester dress 2 sizes too big, a stranger looked at my face across a crowded reception hall and went completely white. But here's what none of them knew that night: that stranger had spent 21 years looking for a face exactly like mine. Somewhere in the months after that reception, there's a courtroom, and a folder with my real name on it, and a number on a DNA report so precise it would end up rewriting every single thing I thought I understood about who I was. I'll get there. Welcome to the channel, by the way. This is where I tell you what it actually looks like when a family builds itself around a lie for 24 years. We tell stories here about the truths people bury, and the moment they finally surface. If a story like that speaks to you, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from tonight. Let me take you back to the only kitchen I actually knew growing up, not the one upstairs with the marble countertops, but the one in the unfinished basement of the Hensley house in Castle Ridge, Pennsylvania, where I had a hot plate, a mini fridge, and a mattress on a metal frame that Walter Hensley had picked up from a curb sometime before I could remember. I want to be careful how I tell you this part, because I know how it can sound from the outside: dramatic, impossible, like something that couldn't happen in an ordinary house on an ordinary street. But it did. It happened slowly enough that I never once, for 23 of those 24 years, thought to call it what it was. I was raised believing I existed to work. Walter and Carol Hensley told me, as far back as I can remember being told anything, that I'd been born into hardship, that my mother hadn't wanted me, and that they'd taken me in out of something they called Christian obligation. They never used the word adopted. They never showed me paperwork. When I was young enough to ask questions, 6, 7 years old, Carol would kneel down to my height, put both hands on my shoulders, and say the same sentence, word for word, every time: "Some people are born to be served, Norah, and some are born to serve. You were born to serve. That's not a punishment. That's just what's true." I believed her. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it matters to everything that comes after. I didn't believe her because I was stupid or weak. I believed her because it was the only explanation I'd ever been given, delivered by the only adults who'd ever raised me, repeated so many times and so calmly that questioning it would have meant questioning the entire floor I was standing on. Tyler was born to the Hensleys the same year I arrived in their house. That detail alone should have told me something, if I'd ever been allowed to think about it clearly. Tyler had a nursery with hand-painted clouds on the ceiling. I had a corner of the basement with a curtain on a wire for privacy. Tyler went to a private school that cost $52,000 a year by the time he graduated. I never went to school at all. Carol homeschooled me for exactly long enough to teach me to read basic instructions and do simple arithmetic, then decided I'd learned enough for what you'll need. It looked, from certain angles, almost like an ordinary large family, dinners together most nights, though I ate mine standing at the counter after serving everyone else. Holidays with decorations I put up and took down. A photograph on the mantel of all 4 of us at the lake house, Tyler's arms slung around my shoulder, both of us smiling. I used to look at that photograph and feel something warm, something that felt close enough to love that I never examined it too closely. I wasn't naive. I was hopeful, in the careful way you're hopeful about something you can't afford to lose. The rules were simple and absolute, and I knew every one of them by the time I was 8. Up at 5:15. Breakfast on the table by 6:30. Tyler's laundry, then the house, then whatever errands Carol needed run within walking distance, because I wasn't allowed a car, wasn't allowed a license, wasn't, I understood much later, allowed to exist anywhere in a system that would have generated a paper trail with my name on it. I didn't have a social security number. I didn't have a birth certificate I'd ever seen. When I asked, once, around age 11, Walter told me the papers had been lost in a fire before we got you and that it wasn't worth the trouble to replace them now. I filed that away, the way I filed away almost everything. I had exactly one saved possession by the time I was 23, $17.32 in a coffee can under my mattress. Money skimmed a few coins at a time from grocery change over roughly 6 years. I don't know what I was saving it for. I think some very quiet part of me knew, even then, that I might need it someday. The punishments, when they came, were never dramatic. I want to be honest about that too, because I know it might be easier to hear if I described something more obviously monstrous. Mostly it was smaller than that. A missed meal if I'd been slow. An extra week of no phone, the one flip phone I was allowed, for emergencies only, that Carol checked weekly. Once, when I was 15 and asked, carefully, whether I could take a class at the community center down the road, Walter didn't yell. He just looked at me for a long moment and said, "You want to leave us that bad?" And I spent the next 3 days apologizing before he'd speak to me again. That was the whole architecture of it. Not cruelty loud enough to be caught. Cruelty quiet enough that I did the work of silencing myself. Tyler knew. I want to say that plainly, early, because it matters later. Tyler wasn't cruel to me, not directly. He'd slip me a candy bar sometimes, or cover for me if I was late finishing a chore before Carol noticed. But he never once, in 24 years, asked why I slept in a basement while he slept under painted clouds. He never asked why I served the food at every holiday and never sat down to eat it. I think, now, that not asking was its own kind of choice. At the time, I was just grateful for the candy bars. If you've ever built your whole sense of safety around not asking the one question that would break everything open, I understand that more than I can easily explain, and I promise you, what happened at that wedding made it impossible for me to keep not asking. The wedding itself came together the way everything in that house came together, around Tyler, entirely. $260,000, a venue 40 minutes outside the city, a dress that cost $9,400 that I steamed by hand the night before because the dry cleaner had creased it slightly. Simone, Tyler's fiancée, was kind to me in a distracted way. She'd smile, say thank you when I refilled her water glass, never once seemed to notice that the woman refilling it was close enough in age to be a bridesmaid instead of staff. I wasn't in the wedding party. I hadn't expected to be. I was there in the black polyester dress, moving between tables with a tray, invisible in the specific way I'd been trained my whole life to be invisible, until a man near table 9, silver-haired, maybe 60, set down his glass so hard the ice cracked, and stared at me like he'd seen something climb up out of the ground. "I'm sorry," he said, when I came to refill his glass, his voice not quite steady. "I have to ask you something strange. Do you know who your mother was?" I told him what I'd always told anyone who asked, that I didn't know, that I'd been given up, that it didn't matter. He didn't look away. He looked at me the way you look at something you're afraid to want too badly, and he said, quiet enough that only I could hear it, "You have her eyes. God help me, you have exactly her eyes." I didn't know it yet, but that man had been looking for those eyes for 21 years, and by the end of that night, everything I thought I understood about the word family was about to come apart at the seams. I told him I needed to get back to the kitchen. That was true, and it was also the fastest way I knew to end a conversation that had made something in my chest go tight and strange, like a hand closing slowly around something I didn't have a name for. I didn't get far. Carol intercepted me by the swinging kitchen door, her smile fixed in the particular way it got fixed when she was angry underneath it. "Who was that man talking to you?" "I don't know." "He asked about my mother." Something moved across her face, fast, controlled, gone almost before I registered it. "You don't have a mother to talk about. You know that." She took the tray out of my hands herself, which she never did. "Go check on the cake table. Now." I went. I want to be honest with you, some part of me, that night, was relieved to be sent away. The stranger's question had unsettled something I'd spent my whole life keeping settled, and being handed a simple task, cake table, plates, forks, felt like solid ground again. I filed the whole exchange away before dessert was even served. I didn't think about it again for 3 days. I should have. The man's name, I learned much later, was Nathaniel Cross. That night, he was just a guest of Simone's family, seated at table 9 because he'd once done business with her father. I didn't know any of that yet. What I knew, 3 days after the wedding, was that Walter called me into his study, the room I was never invited into, the room I cleaned once a week while he was at work, and shut the door behind me. "That man at the wedding," Walter said. "Did he give you anything? A card, a number, anything?" "No." "Did he say anything else to you? Besides asking about your mother?" "No, Walter. Just that." He studied me for a long moment, the way he did when he was deciding whether I was lying. I wasn't. But something about the intensity of the question, Walter never asked me about strangers, never seemed to think I was worth strangers' attention, planted the first real crack in 6 years of careful not noticing. "If he contacts you again," Walter said, "you tell me immediately. You understand?" "Immediately." I said yes. I always said yes. But I carried that conversation with me differently than I'd carried anything before, the way you carry a stone in your shoe that you keep meaning to shake out and never quite do. It was Simone, of all people, who told me his name. She called 2 weeks after the wedding, a courtesy call, she said, checking that everything for the reception had gone smoothly, since I'd apparently done most of the actual coordinating that Carol had taken credit for. Near the end of the call, almost as an afterthought, she mentioned it. "Oh, my dad's old business friend, the one who got weird at your table? Nathaniel Cross. He asked me for your name after the wedding. Hope that's not strange." It was strange. I didn't tell her that. I said it was fine, thanked her for calling, and sat very still in the basement for a long time afterward with the flip phone in my hand, turning the name over like a coin. Nathaniel Cross. I didn't know yet that it was also, nearly, my own name. 2 days later, a letter arrived at the house, addressed, unusually, directly to me, first name only, no last name, because I didn't have one that existed on paper. Carol got to the mailbox first, the way she always did. I found the envelope in the kitchen trash that evening, already opened, the letter itself gone. I fished it out. Coffee grounds smeared one corner. I could still read enough. "If I'm wrong, I apologize for the intrusion. But if I'm right, please know that someone has been looking for you for a very long time." I didn't know what to do with that. I threw the envelope back in the trash exactly where I'd found it, and I didn't sleep more than 2 hours that night. If you've ever felt something start shifting under you before you had a single fact to explain why, stay with me, because what I found 3 weeks later confirmed I hadn't been imagining it. Walter's behavior changed that month in ways I noticed and didn't understand. He started locking his study door even when he was home. He had 2 hushed phone calls I overheard fragments of, once saying, low and fast, "It was handled years ago, there's no paper trail, I don't know what he thinks he's going to find," and once, simply, "If she starts asking questions, you handle it. I'm not doing this again." Again. I filed that word away with everything else. I didn't understand it yet. I understood, with a kind of cold certainty I'd never felt before, that it meant something had happened before, something involving me, that I had no memory of and no access to. Carol, meanwhile, started watching me in a way she hadn't before. Not suspicious of anything I'd done, suspicious of what I might learn. She kept the flip phone in her own purse for safekeeping that whole month. She stood in doorways when I did chores in rooms with windows facing the street, like she was checking whether anyone was watching the house, or whether I was watching for someone. Once, drying dishes side by side, a rare quiet moment, the kind we used to have sometimes before all of this started, she said, without looking at me, "Whatever that man says to you, Norah, you remember who raised you. You remember who fed you and clothed you when nobody else wanted you." Her voice cracked slightly on the last part, and for one strange moment I almost comforted her instead of asking a single question. That was the pattern of that whole month. Notice something wrong. Rationalize it. Stay silent. Notice the next thing. I want to tell you I broke that pattern immediately. I didn't. It took another 6 weeks, and one very small, very ordinary discovery, to finally push me into doing something instead of just noticing. The discovery came from Tyler, of all people. Tyler, who I'd have told you, up until that point, knew everything and said nothing. He found me in the basement one evening, sitting on the edge of my mattress with the coffee can of savings on my lap, just holding it, not counting it, the way you hold something when you don't know what else to do with your hands. He stood in the doorway a long moment before he spoke. "That guy at my wedding," he said. "Dad's been weird since then. Really weird. I noticed. I heard him on the phone last week. He said something about a hospital. Meridian General. And a year, I think it was 2001, but I wasn't listening close enough to be sure." Tyler shifted his weight, not quite meeting my eyes. "I don't know why I'm telling you this. It probably doesn't mean anything." It meant everything, though neither of us said that out loud. I sat with that fragment, a hospital name, a year, for 3 straight nights before I let myself do anything with it. On the 4th night, I waited until the house was asleep, took the flip phone back out of Carol's purse while she slept, and searched the only 2 words I had, Meridian General. What came up wasn't what I expected. A local news archive, a story from years back, mostly forgotten, an infant abduction from Meridian General Hospital's maternity ward, an infant girl, taken from her bassinet within an hour of birth while her mother slept off delivery. The mother's name was in the article. Eleanor Cross. 28 years old. The case had gone cold within 18 months. I sat on that mattress with the phone glowing in the dark and read the article 4 times. I didn't cry. I didn't feel anything I could name yet, just a strange, hollow ringing, like a bell struck somewhere far away. I put the phone back exactly where I'd found it before morning. I didn't tell Walter or Carol what I'd read. And I didn't tell Tyler either, not yet. Some part of me needed to hold this alone a little longer, the way you hold something fragile before you're ready to let anyone else see you carrying it. I still didn't fully believe it applied to me. That's the part one needs you to understand. Knowing a name in a hospital and a year is not the same as knowing, with your whole body, that the story belongs to you. I told myself it was a coincidence. Common enough hospital. Common enough kind of tragedy. I didn't yet know that in 4 days, a woman with a badge and a folder full of DNA consent forms would be standing on the Hensleys' front porch, and that everything I'd spent 24 years training myself not to ask would finally, whether I was ready or not, get answered. The woman on the porch introduced herself as Agent Priya Sandoval, FBI, and asked to speak with the young woman who goes by Norah. Carol answered the door and told her, flatly, that no such person lived there, a lie so immediate and so smooth that I understood, standing frozen in the hallway behind her, that Carol had been rehearsing it. "Ma'am, I have a signed request from Nathaniel Cross asking us to look into a possible family match," Agent Sandoval said, unbothered. "I'd like to speak with her directly, if she's willing." I stepped forward before Carol could close the door. I don't know what made me do it, some small, stubborn thing that had been building in me for 6 weeks finally breaking the surface. "I'm Norah." Carol's hand found my wrist, gripping hard enough to bruise, disguised as a sisterly touch. "She's not interested," Carol said, smiling at the agent like this was all a minor misunderstanding. "She has no reason to think she's involved in anything like that." I'd still like to hear that from her. I looked at Carol. I looked at the agent. And for the first time in 24 years, I said a sentence in that doorway that wasn't the one Carol wanted me to say. "I'd like to talk to her. Alone, if that's all right." The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds. It felt considerably longer. Agent Sandoval and I sat on the porch steps, out of Carol's hearing, while she explained it plainly. An infant girl abducted from Meridian General Hospital in 2001. A mother named Eleanor Cross who had spent 18 months searching before the case went cold, a brother, Nathaniel, who had never stopped believing his sister's daughter was alive somewhere. He'd hired private investigators on and off for 2 decades. He'd seen thousands of women who weren't her. Something about my face, at that wedding, had convinced him he might finally have found her. A DNA test would tell us for certain, she said. It's simple. A cheek swab. You don't have to decide anything else today, just whether you want to know. I thought about the coffee can of savings under my mattress. I thought about 17 years, no, 24 years, of being told exactly what I was and what I was for. I thought about Carol's hand on my wrist, and Walter's voice through his study door saying if she starts asking questions, you handle it, and something in me, quiet but absolute, decided I was done not knowing. I want to know, I said. I did the swab on the porch. Agent Sandoval sealed it, thanked me, and told me results usually took 2 to 3 weeks, sometimes faster if flagged as connected to an open federal case. Before she left, she gave me a card with her direct line and said, quietly, if anything happens at home because of this, anything at all, you call me. Day or night. I understood, hearing that she already suspected more than she was saying. The 3 weeks that followed were the longest of my life, and also, in some ways, the most dangerous. Walter didn't speak to me directly for 4 straight days, which had never happened before. The silence, in that house, had always meant something was coming. Carol took the flip phone away entirely, said I'd proven I couldn't be trusted with it, and I lost my only thread to the outside world except the few minutes here and there when Tyler let me borrow his. It was during one of those borrowed minutes that Tyler finally told me what he'd been holding back. I need to tell you something, he said, sitting across from me at the kitchen table late one night, voice low. I heard Dad on the phone again. Longer this time. He hesitated, and I watched him decide, in real time, whether to keep protecting a version of his family that had already started coming apart. He said something about $15,000. And a name, Delacroix, I think, or something close to that. He said the broker a couple times. I didn't understand the word broker in that context yet, not fully, not with the weight it would come to carry. I filed it, the way I'd filed everything, and asked the only question that mattered. Do you think it's true? What that agent thinks? Tyler didn't answer for a long time. When he finally did, his voice had something in it I'd never heard from him before, not guilt exactly, not yet, but the first edge of it. I don't know. But I think I've always known something wasn't right. About how they treat you. I just never let myself think about what it actually meant. That was as close as Tyler came, in that moment, to admitting what I already understood, that his silence, for 24 years, had never been innocent. It had just been comfortable. If you've ever waited for a piece of paper to tell you something your whole body already suspected, stay with me, because the wait itself, I promise you, is its own kind of proof. 2 things happened in the second week that I need to tell you about, because at the time they pointed in 2 completely different directions, and I didn't know which one to trust. The first was Carol, crying at the kitchen table one evening, more openly than I'd ever seen her cry. You have to understand, she said, we saved you. Whatever they tell you, whatever happened before, we gave you a home. We gave you a family. She reached for my hand, and for one disorienting moment, some old, trained part of me almost took it. Don't let a stranger's story erase 24 years of us. I wanted, badly, for that to be the whole truth. It would have been so much simpler if it were. The second thing was smaller, and it happened almost by accident. I was cleaning Walter's study, my one remaining chore that took me anywhere near his things, and found, tucked behind a filing cabinet where it had clearly slipped and been forgotten, a single sheet of paper. Old, yellowed at the edges. A handwritten note, not typed, in handwriting I didn't recognize. W. Confirmed placement complete. Balance received in full, $15,000. No further contact expected. Destroy this after reading. R.D. I stood there a long moment holding it. It wasn't proof of everything. I didn't understand yet who R.D. was, or what placement meant in the coldest, most literal sense of that word. But I understood enough. I photographed it with Tyler's phone, in secret, hands shaking so badly the first 2 pictures came out blurred. Then I put the paper back exactly where I'd found it, behind the cabinet, because some instinct told me it needed to still be there if anyone ever came looking. I didn't confront Walter with it. I didn't tell Carol. I didn't even tell Tyler that night. I held it alone, the way I'd learned to hold everything alone, and I told myself I was waiting for the right moment. The truth was closer to this. I was terrified that if I said it out loud too soon, it would disappear, the way so many things in that house had a way of quietly disappearing once someone noticed them. The DNA results came back on a Tuesday, 19 days after the swab. Agent Sandoval called the number Tyler had, since I still didn't have my phone back, and asked to meet me somewhere away from the house. We sat in her car outside the public library, and she handed me a single printed page. Probability of maternal aunt/uncle relationship, 99.98%. Underneath it, a name I'd read once before, in a forgotten news article at 2 in the morning, Eleanor Cross, deceased. Maternal match confirmed through familial DNA comparison with surviving relatives. Your mother passed away 6 years ago, Agent Sandoval said gently. Complications from a long illness. I'm sorry you're hearing that in the same breath as everything else. But your uncle, Nathaniel, he's been waiting outside the library, if you want to see him. He didn't want to push. He said he'd wait as long as it took. I sat in that car for a long moment, the paper trembling slightly in my hands. 24 years of you were born to serve collapsing under one number on a page. I thought about the coffee can under my mattress. I thought about the photograph on the mantel, Tyler's arm around my shoulder, the warmth I'd never let myself examine too closely. I thought about Walter's voice through a closed door, I'm not doing this again, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost violent, exactly what that sentence had meant. I got out of the car. Nathaniel was standing near the library steps, exactly where he'd said he'd be, and when he saw my face he didn't say anything at all. He just opened his arms, slowly, like he was afraid I might not want them, and waited to see what I'd do. I didn't know yet that agents were already at the county courthouse pulling adoption records that didn't exist, already tracing a name, Delacroix, that would connect a basement in Castleridge to a federal cold case nobody had closed in over 2 decades. I only knew, standing on those library steps, that for the first time in my entire life, someone was waiting for me to choose, instead of telling me what I was. I didn't hug him right away. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters more than the moment I finally did. I stood there for what felt like a long time, looking at a stranger's face that was somehow, impossibly, shaped a little like mine, the same slope to the eyebrows, the same stubborn set to the jaw I'd only ever seen in a mirror. Nathaniel kept his arms open, patient, and said, quietly, you don't have to do anything right now. I just wanted you to know I was here. That undid something in me faster than the DNA report had. I stepped into his arms, and he held on carefully, like I might break, and somewhere behind us Agent Sandoval gave us both a small, respectful distance. She looked for you every single day, Nathaniel said into the top of my head. Your mother. Every single day until the day she couldn't anymore. I made her a promise before she died that I wouldn't stop. I didn't cry then. That came later, alone, in a hotel room the FBI had quietly arranged for me that night, a room with a lock I controlled, for the first time in my life. I cried for almost 2 hours, not entirely sure what I was crying for. My mother, who I'd never know. 24 years I couldn't get back. Or maybe just the strange, disorienting relief of finally being believed. The investigation moved faster than I expected once the DNA confirmation gave it federal weight. Agent Sandoval explained it to me over the following days, piece by piece, careful not to overwhelm me all at once. The handwritten note I'd photographed, the one signed RD, led them to a woman named Renata Delacroix, already under a separate federal investigation for running an underground adoption network out of 3 states, moving infants through falsified paperwork and complicit intermediaries for over a decade before she'd gone quiet around 2004. Walter and Carol had been one of at least 11 documented families who'd paid her for a child with no legal trail. My case, an infant taken directly from a hospital rather than surrendered by a struggling parent, as some of the others reportedly had been, made mine the one that finally connected Delacroix's network to an open federal abduction case. I want to tell you I felt triumphant hearing that. Mostly I felt sick. 11 families. Possibly more they hadn't found yet. I sat with that number for a long time, understanding for the first time just how much bigger this was than my own basement, my own coffee can of savings, my own 24 years. Walter and Carol were arrested on a Thursday morning, 11 days after the DNA results came back. I wasn't there to see it. I'd moved out 3 days earlier, into a small apartment Nathaniel had quietly arranged and refused to let me argue about, but Tyler called me within the hour, his voice shaking in a way I'd genuinely never heard from him before. They took them both, he said. Federal agents, a warrant, the whole thing. Mom was screaming that it was all a misunderstanding. Dad didn't say anything at all. I sat with the phone against my ear a long moment before I answered. Are you okay? I don't know. I don't know what I am right now. A pause, longer this time. I keep thinking about how many times I saw you in that basement and just went back to my room. I keep thinking about that. I know, Tyler. I'm not asking you to forgive me for it. Good, I said. Because I'm not there yet. It was the most honest thing I'd said to him in 24 years, and something about saying it plainly, without softening it, felt like the first genuinely free thing I'd done since walking out of that house. If you've ever had to watch the people who raised you become strangers to you in the space of a single phone call, stay with me, because what happened at the arraignment 3 weeks later was the part that finally, fully, closed that door for me. I chose to attend. Nathaniel offered to go in my place, said I didn't owe anyone my presence, but I needed to see it, needed my own eyes on the moment the story stopped being something that happened to me in private and became something the world had finally agreed was real. Carol saw me first, from across the courtroom, and her whole face rearranged itself into something pleading. Norah, sweetheart, tell them we're your family, tell them what we did for you. I did tell them, I said. Quiet. Steady. I hadn't planned those words, they simply arrived, fully formed, the way true things sometimes do. I told them everything. Something in her face went still. Behind her, Walter didn't turn around at all, sat rigid, jaw locked, staring straight ahead like refusing to look at me could somehow undo what was happening. It was the first time in my life I'd ever seen him refuse to assert control over a room, and I understood, watching it, that it wasn't dignity. It was the first crack in a denial he wasn't ready to abandon yet. The prosecutor read the charges: trafficking-related offenses, document fraud, child endangerment across more than 2 decades, and I watched Carol's carefully composed grief curdle, halfway through, into something colder. We gave her everything, she said to her attorney, loud enough to carry. Clothes, food, a roof. Do you know what some of these children get instead? It wasn't quite a confession. It also wasn't quite a denial anymore. It was the sound of someone running out of places to stand. Simone left Tyler within the month, not dramatically, from what he told me later, just quietly and completely, packing what was hers and telling him she couldn't build a life with someone who'd learned to look away as skillfully as he had. He lost his job soon after, some quiet HR conversation about reputational concerns once the story hit local news. He called me twice a week for a while, mostly just to talk, mostly just because, I think, I was the only person left who still picked up. I didn't rescue him. I want to say that plainly, because I know some part of this story might make you expect me to. I listened. I told him the truth when he asked for it. But I'd spent 24 years absorbing consequences that belonged to other people, and I wasn't going to spend the next 24 doing it again, not even for him. 2 open loops closed for me that same month, in small, unremarkable moments that somehow mattered more than the arraignment had. The first was the coffee can. I went back to the Castleridge house once, with Agent Sandoval beside me, to collect whatever few things were legally mine. The house was already half empty, most of it seized as part of the asset freeze. I found the can exactly where I'd left it, untouched, $17.32 still inside. I stood in that basement a long moment, looking at the mattress, the curtain on its wire, 24 years compressed into one small underground room. I took the can. I left everything else. The second was a letter, the real one this time, not fished out of a trash can with coffee grounds smeared across the corner. Nathaniel gave it to me on the porch of my new apartment, said he'd been waiting for the right moment. It was from my mother, written 8 years before she died, meant to be given to me if I was ever found. Her handwriting was careful, deliberate, like she'd rewritten it more than once to get it right. I don't know where you are tonight, or what they've told you about who you are. Whatever it isn't true. You were wanted. You are wanted. I have looked for you every single day, and I will keep looking for every day I have left, and if I run out of days before I run out of looking, your uncle will finish what I started. You were never meant to serve anyone. You were only ever meant to be loved. I sat on my own front step, in my own apartment, with a key I controlled and a phone that was actually mine, and read that letter until the light changed. I didn't feel healed, not all at once. But something in me, reading it, finally let go of 24 years of a sentence Carol had taught me to believe. Some people are born to serve. My mother had answered that 8 years before she died, without ever knowing she'd need to. I didn't know yet exactly what I'd do with the rest of my life. I only knew, folding that letter carefully back into its envelope, that whatever it was going to be, it would be mine to choose, not something handed down to me by people who'd never had the right to shape it in the first place. The trial took 11 months. I won't walk you through all of it. Court dates blur together after a while, procedural and slow, nothing like the version of justice you see in movies. What I'll tell you is the shape of it. Walter's attorney tried, for a while, to argue the note I'd found was inadmissible, that the chain of custody was compromised because I'd photographed it myself instead of leaving it for police to discover. It didn't work. Renata Delacroix, facing her own mounting charges, agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence, and her records, meticulous, damning, kept for reasons that still make no sense to me except that some people can't help documenting even the things that will destroy them, confirmed everything. $15,000, paid in 2 installments, for an infant girl matching my description, delivered within 6 weeks of a hospital abduction 2 states away. Walter was sentenced to 16 years in federal prison. Carol received 10. The house was already gone by then, seized months earlier, along with most of their remaining assets. I sat in the courtroom for the sentencing and felt, mostly, a kind of exhausted stillness, not triumph, not exactly relief, just the sense of a very long-held breath finally being let out. I want to tell you about a moment that came a few weeks before the sentencing, one I've never fully explained to anyone, because I think it matters more than the number of years attached to either of their names. Agent Sandoval told me, much later, what Walter had said to his attorney the week before the trial started, something he never said to me directly, something I only learned secondhand. I did what I thought I had to do. We couldn't have kids of our own for years before Tyler came, and then when Tyler finally came, I still felt like something was missing from that house. I told myself I was giving a child a home. I told myself it wasn't the same as what I'd read about, what happens to some of these kids. I told myself a lot of things. I don't know anymore which ones I actually believed and which ones I just needed to. That was as close as he ever came to something resembling honesty, and even then, it wasn't offered to me. It was offered to a lawyer, in private, in the last calm room he'd have for a very long time. I didn't hear it until after the sentencing. By then, it didn't change anything for me. It just filled in one more piece of a picture I'd already understood the shape of. I asked to visit them in prison, separately, about 2 months after sentencing. Nathaniel didn't understand why, at first, asked me gently whether I was sure, whether I needed to put myself through it. I told him I wasn't looking for reconciliation. I needed to close a door I'd opened, and I needed to close it myself, on my own terms, in a room where I finally, for the first time in my life, had all the power. Carol went first. She looked smaller across that table than she had in the kitchen doorway, smaller than she'd looked crying at that table over stolen years. She reached for something like the old script the moment she saw me. "Nora, sweetheart, I knew you'd come, I knew you couldn't stay away from," and stopped, because something in my face must have told her the sentence wasn't going to land the way it used to. "I'm not here to forgive you," I said. I'd rehearsed almost nothing else, but I'd rehearsed that. "I'm here to tell you what you took. Not the money. Not even the years, though I want you to know exactly how many." He 23, before anyone came looking. "I mean the smaller thing. I didn't know my own name for 24 years. I didn't know I was allowed to want things. You took that, and I'm not interested in whether you meant to." She cried. Genuinely, I think that was never entirely performance with her, which somehow made it worse, not better. "We loved you," she said. "In our own way. I know that's not enough. I know that now." "It was never love," I said. "I understand that now, too. You can call it whatever helped you sleep. I don't have to call it the same thing." She didn't argue. She just sat there, crying, while I looked at her for a long moment and then stood up. I didn't say goodbye. There didn't seem to be a version of that word that fit what I was actually doing. Walter was different. Where Carol had reached for old warmth, he reached for old authority, sitting straight-backed across from me the way he used to sit at the head of the dinner table, like the room itself still belonged to him. "You have every right to be angry," he said, which sounded, for one disorienting second, almost like an apology, until he kept going. "But you need to understand something. Whatever that man's family had planned for you, whatever life you think you missed, I gave you stability. Structure. A roof. Some of these trafficked kids end up in far worse places than a clean basement with 3 meals a day." "A clean basement," I repeated. Flat. I let the silence after it do more work than any argument I could have made. His jaw worked for a moment. "I'm not going to sit here and pretend I did nothing wrong. I bought a child. I know how that sounds. But I raised you. That has to count for something." "It counts," I said. "It counts as 16 years. I stood up before he could respond, because I understood, finally, standing in that room, that there was no version of this conversation where he was going to arrive at something true. He was going to keep explaining himself in the language of a man who still believed, somewhere underneath all of it, that intention could outweigh what he'd actually done. He was still talking when the guard came to walk me out, something about how I'd understand better when I was older, how anger was easier than gratitude. I didn't hear the end of it. I didn't need to. Tyler was waiting for me in the parking lot, which I hadn't asked him to do and hadn't expected. He'd come separately, hadn't been inside, just wanted to be there when I came out. Neither of us said much on the walk to my car. "How was it?" he finally asked. "Over," I said. That's the only word I have for it right now. He nodded, looked at his hands. "I've been seeing someone. A therapist. Trying to figure out, I don't know, how I became someone who could watch what I watched for 24 years and call it normal." "That's good, Tyler. I know it doesn't fix anything." "No," I agreed. "It doesn't. But it's not nothing either." I meant that. It was the first time since the arraignment that I'd been able to say something to him that was both honest and, in its own small way, kind, not because he'd earned forgiveness, but because I'd stopped needing him to be either entirely redeemed or entirely condemned. He could just be someone slowly, imperfectly, trying. I drove home that evening with the windows down, the coffee can sitting on the passenger seat where I'd started keeping it, empty now except for the $17.32 I'd never spent. I didn't feel lighter, not in any dramatic way. I felt, mostly, done, the specific, hard-won kind of done that only comes after you've said every true thing you needed to say, in a room where, for once, someone else had to sit still and listen. The trust fund paperwork took another 4 months to untangle, $9,614,782.40, money my mother had set aside years before her death, growing quietly in accounts I'd never known existed, meant for a daughter she never stopped believing would come home. I didn't touch most of it right away. For a long time, it sat there the way the coffee can had sat under my mattress, proof of something I wasn't ready to fully claim yet. Tyler asked me for help eventually, not directly, not at first, but through small comments that built toward it. He'd lost the job, then the car, then the apartment he'd shared with Simone before she left. I understood, listening to him talk around the edges of it, that some part of him believed I owed him something now, that 24 years of guilt might translate into a check that made the guilt easier to carry. "I'm not going to give you money, Tyler," I told him, the one time he finally asked outright. "Not because I don't care what happens to you. Because I spent 24 years being told what I owed people who were supposed to take care of me instead. I'm not doing that again, in either direction." He didn't argue. I think some part of him had expected exactly that answer, and maybe even needed to hear it, finally, to build something of his own instead of inheriting it, the way he'd inherited everything else his whole life without ever once having to ask what it cost someone else. I enrolled in community college that fall, the same kind of class, roughly, that I'd asked to take at 15 and been refused. I started slow, an introductory psychology course, mostly because I wanted language for what had happened to me that wasn't just the language of a courtroom. By the second semester, I knew what I wanted to build toward. A counselor mentioned trauma-informed therapy almost in passing, and something in me recognized it immediately, the way you recognize a room you've somehow already been standing in your whole life. I still think, sometimes, about the 11 other families the investigation uncovered, the ones like mine, and the ones different enough that their stories never made local news the way mine eventually did. I think about how many of them are still sitting in a basement somewhere, still believing some version of the sentence I believed for 23 years. I don't know all their names. I probably never will. But I know, now, what I want the rest of my life to be built around, and it isn't distance from what happened to me. It's proximity to it, on purpose, in a room where I finally get to be the one asking the questions instead of being too afraid to. I moved out of the temporary apartment that spring, into a small house of my own, nothing extravagant, nothing that would have impressed Carol, which was, I noticed, exactly why I liked it. I painted the kitchen myself, badly, and didn't fix the uneven line where the color met the ceiling. I kept the coffee can on the windowsill above the sink, where I could see it every morning while I made coffee for exactly one person. Nathaniel came by most Sundays. We didn't talk about the case much anymore, most weeks. We talked about ordinary things, the kind of ordinary I'd never been allowed as a child. What I was reading. Whether the tomatoes he'd planted in my small backyard were going to survive the summer. Once, half joking, he asked if I remembered anything at all from before the Hensleys, any flash of memory from those first hours before I was taken. I told him no, and meant it, and he nodded like that was all right too, like he understood that some doors just don't open, no matter how many years you spend standing in front of them. I still wonder, sometimes, what my mother would have made of the person I became instead of the daughter she was waiting for. Whether the 24-year-old sitting across from Nathaniel every Sunday, studying trauma theory at a kitchen table she'd painted herself, would have looked anything like the child she'd imagined finding. I don't think that question has an answer, and I've stopped needing it to. I carry her letter instead, the real one, not the one fished out of a trash can, folded now into the front cover of my psychology textbook, close enough to reach whenever I need to remember why I'm doing any of this. I could have stayed angry. Some days, I still am. But I chose, most days, to build something instead of just carrying what was done to me, and I've come to understand that as the only kind of victory that ever actually held up over time. I recognized myself again, somewhere in that second semester, filling out a scholarship application with my own actual, legal, hard-won name printed at the top of the page. Nora Cross. Not a name given to me by people who owned me. A name that had been waiting for me the whole time, in a hospital record from 2001, in a letter written 8 years before I ever got to read it, in the shape of my own eyebrows on a stranger's face across a wedding reception. That's my story. A coffee can with $17.32 still in it, a letter I never got to read until it was almost too late, a name I finally got to claim as my own. Thank you for staying with me through all of it. If any part of this found something familiar in your own life, tell me in the comments. I read every one, and I'd love to hear your story too. See you in the next one. Looking back now, the moment that should have told me something was wrong came far earlier than any of us like to admit. That photograph on the mantel, Tyler's arm around my shoulder, both of us smiling like equals in a house where we'd never once been treated as equals. I called that warmth back then. It wasn't warmth. It was the appearance of belonging, built carefully enough that I never had to notice the difference, because noticing would have cost more than I was ready to pay at 8 years old, or 11, or even 23. There was a second thing I should have named sooner, and it wasn't about Walter or Carol at all, it was Tyler's silence. Not asking why I slept in a basement wasn't neutral. It was a choice, repeated daily for 24 years, and it let an entire system of harm continue simply because questioning it would have cost him a comfort he'd never had to examine. I understand now that silence isn't the absence of a decision. It's one of the most powerful decisions a person can make, and it's exactly as consequential as speaking would have been. The turning point wasn't the DNA report, though that's the part that made everything legally real. It was smaller than that. It was the night Tyler told me what he'd overheard on the phone, a hospital name and a year, handed to me almost carelessly, and my choice, 4 days later, to finally search those 2 words myself instead of filing them away the way I'd filed away everything else for 23 years. That was the first time I chose to know something instead of protecting myself from knowing it. Everything after that followed from that one decision. I used to believe that safety meant not asking questions. I don't believe that anymore. Safety, for me, turned out to be the opposite. It was finally asking, even when I was terrified of the answer, even when asking meant losing the only family, however false, that I'd ever known. I think about how long I mistook obedience for love, and I understand now that the two were never actually related. Love doesn't require you to disappear in order to earn it. If anything, I've been through means something to someone listening tonight. I hope it's that. Walter never once, across 16 years of sentencing and every conversation that led up to it, used the word wrong without immediately attaching a but to it. That's the real center of this story, not the trafficking charges themselves, but a man who spent 2 decades constructing a version of himself where love and ownership could occupy the same sentence, and never noticed the contradiction because noticing would have cost him the only identity he had left to stand on. There's a pattern here worth naming beyond this specific family. Systems of control rarely announce themselves as control. They announce themselves as care, a roof, 3 meals, structure, stability, and the person inside the system is taught to measure their worth by gratitude for those things rather than by whether they were ever free to leave them. Nora's 23 years of not asking weren't naivety. They were the predictable result of being handed, from early childhood, exactly one explanation for her existence and no alternative language with which to question it. You cannot doubt a story you were never given the tools to compare against anything else. What makes this story land differently than a simple villain and victim account is Tyler, not because his passivity was ever excusable, but because it demonstrates something true about how these systems actually survive. Walter and Carol needed active cruelty to maintain control. They only needed one witness's comfortable silence to make sure no one outside the house ever had reason to look closer. Complicity, in this story, didn't require malice. It only required the willingness to keep receiving candy bars and painted ceilings without asking what they cost someone else. Nora's trust fund, her degree, her reclaimed name, none of that is really the resolution here. The resolution is smaller and harder to see, a woman who spent 24 years being told what she owed other people, learning, slowly and deliberately, to ask instead what she owed herself. That shift, more than any court sentence, is the actual measure of what was reclaimed. Most people will never live anything close to what Norah survived. But nearly everyone, at some point, has mistaken obedience for belonging, or silence for peace. The question worth sitting with isn't whether you've ever built a life around not asking something. It's what you might finally hear, the day you decide to ask it anyway.